evening was shining with golden lights and soft music inside the famous Grandwood Hall. It was one of those nights when everything looked perfect. Elegant dresses, polished shoes, and people talking in low, confident voices. The air smelled of perfume and freshly baked bread. Crystal chandeliers hung high above, throwing a warm glow on the tables covered with white silk cloths. Laughter and the clinking of glasses mixed with the gentle hum of conversation. It was a night meant for celebration and class. Waiters and waitresses moved gracefully between the tables, their trays filled with drinks that sparkled under the lights. Among them was Clara, a young woman wearing a neat black and white uniform. Her hair was tied back neatly, and though her face was calm, her eyes showed something deeper, a quiet kind of focus. She wasn't like the others who chatted softly while working. Clara kept mostly to herself, always polite, always careful. She made sure every glass was filled, every guest was happy, and every plate was perfectly placed. No one in the glittering crowd knew much about her. To them, she was just another waitress, one of many faces serving food to the important people of the city. But to Clara, this place was something different. Every night she worked here, she felt both close to and far away from something she once loved deeply. Near the front of the hall stood a grand piano, glossy black, shining like a mirror under the lights. It sat quietly, waiting for someone to bring it to life, and every time Clara passed it, her heart gave a tiny, familiar ache. That piano reminded her of another time, a time when her life was filled with music instead of trays and tables. She had been a pianist once, before life took her in a different direction. Her fingers still remembered the feeling of the smooth ivory keys, the way sound could rise and fall like the rhythm of a heartbeat. But that world felt far away now. The guests at Grandwood Hall were not ordinary people. They were rich, powerful, and proud. Men wore tuxedos and women wore elegant gowns that shimmered as they moved. They talked about art, business, travel, about everything except the people serving them. Clara knew how invisible she was to them, but she didn't mind much. She had learned to find small joys in quiet moments. The smell of fresh roses on the tables, the beauty of the piano's polished surface, and the soft laughter that filled the room like a melody of its own. The event that night was a charity dinner, hosted to raise money for a children's foundation. A famous pianist had been invited to perform later in the evening, and everyone was looking forward to it. For now, though, the guests were focused on their meals and conversations. The atmosphere was cheerful, but also very formal, the kind of place where people smiled politely rather than laughed loudly. Clara carried a tray of champagne glasses past a group of men who were discussing stocks. One of them waved his empty glass without even looking at her. She replaced it smoothly and walked away. Her steps were light, almost musical, as if she were unconsciously keeping rhythm to a song only she could hear. As she moved between tables, she caught sight of her reflection in the piano's shiny lid. For a moment she stopped. Her own face looked strange to her. Not the girl who used to play in small competitions, not the student who dreamed of performing on big stages, but someone quieter, older somehow. She smiled faintly and turned away before anyone noticed her pause. In the corner, the pianist hired for the night was setting up his sheet music. He was a middle-aged man in a crisp suit, adjusting his tie and flexing his fingers like a magician preparing for a trick. The guests glanced at him with polite interest but soon turned back to their conversations. They had seen performances before, nothing unusual about it. Clara knew his kind. Confident, professional, and talented. She didn't feel jealous, just wistful. She wondered what it would feel like to sit at that piano again, to let the music take over her hands. But she brushed the thought aside. Her job tonight was to serve, not to dream. Still, a part of her couldn't help but imagine, if only for a second, how the room might sound if she played. How the notes would fill the hall, how people would stop talking, how the chandelier lights would seem to dance to the rhythm of her music. The thought made her smile softly, but she quickly shook it off and continued working. As the evening moved on, the room grew warmer, the laughter louder. Plates were cleared, desserts were served, and a feeling of celebration floated in the air. Everything was running perfectly. At least it seemed that way. None of the guests could have guessed that before the night ended, something extraordinary would happen. Somewhere deep inside, Clara felt that something was coming. A strange kind of pull, like the quiet before a storm. The piano waited silently, the guests continued to laugh, and Clara went about her duties unaware that soon the entire room would fall silent for her. That night, the story had already begun, quietly behind the silver trays and crystal glasses. It just hadn't been noticed yet. But before the last candle burned out, everyone in that elegant hall would remember the name of the waitress who dared to play. Clara finished her shift late that night, long after the guests had left and the hall had turned quiet again. The golden lights were dimmed and only a few candles flickered on the tables. The air smelled of flowers and wine mixed with the faint scent of polished wood. She stacked the last few plates, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked around. The hall always felt different when it was empty, calmer, softer, almost like it was breathing again after holding so much noise. Her eyes landed on the piano again. It stood there alone, reflecting the candlelight on its glossy black surface. The lid was still open, showing the golden strings inside. To anyone else, it was just an instrument. But to Clara, it was something more. A memory of who she used to be. When she was a little girl, her parents couldn't afford much, but they had found a small second-hand piano for her when she turned 10. It was scratched and missing one key, but to Clara, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Every day after school, she would sit for hours, learning songs from old books or copying what she heard on the radio. She didn't have a teacher at first, just curiosity and a big heart full of music. Eventually, her talent caught someone's attention. Her school music teacher, Mrs. Evans, heard her playing during a talent show and was amazed. With the teacher's help, Clara earned a small scholarship to take piano lessons. That's when everything changed. For years, music became her entire world. She practiced before sunrise and again after dinner. She joined small competitions and people started to notice her. There was one evening years ago when she played at a small local concert. The audience had stood up and clapped for her like she was a star. She remembered the tears that filled her eyes that night, not from pride, but from the feeling of finally being seen. But life doesn't always follow our dreams. When her father fell ill, Clara had to leave her music studies to work full-time. Bills had to be paid, medicines had to be bought, and dreams had to wait. She told herself it would be temporary, that she'd return to music soon. But 1 month turned into a year, then another. The piano at home gathered dust. The sound of her music faded into memory. Now standing in the quiet Grandwood Hall, she felt that same ache again. The ache of a song trapped inside her. Her hands twitched slightly as if remembering the feeling of keys beneath her fingers. She looked around, no one was there. Slowly, almost shyly, she walked toward the piano. Her reflection moved along the black surface as she came closer. She took a slow breath, reached out, and touched the keys. They were cool and smooth, just as she remembered. She pressed one softly. The note echoed through the empty hall, clear, gentle, almost like a whisper. It sent a shiver down her spine. She smiled a little and pressed another key. Then another. Soon, without thinking, she began to play a soft tune. Something simple, something that used to be her favorite. The sound floated through the air, bouncing off the tall windows and empty chairs. It felt like time had stopped. For the first time in years, she felt alive again. The music poured out of her hands naturally, flowing like a river that had finally found its path again. Her shoulders relaxed, her eyes closed, and everything else, and the long hours, the tired feet, the noise of the world, disappeared. She didn't notice that someone was watching. From the doorway, one of the cleaners, Mrs. Doyle, stood frozen with her mop in hand. She had worked with Clara for months but had never seen her like this. Confident, glowing, lost in her own world. The song was sad yet beautiful, filled with emotion that words could never explain. Mrs. Doyle didn't want to interrupt. She just listened, quietly smiling. When Clara finally stopped, the last note hung in the air for a few seconds before fading into silence. She looked at her hands, a little surprised. It felt as if the piano had spoken through her. She stood there, half smiling, half teary, until Mrs. Doyle gently clapped her hands together. "My goodness, Clara," she said softly. "You play like an angel." Clara turned, embarrassed. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I was just—" Mrs. Doyle shook her head. "Don't apologize, dear. That was beautiful. You shouldn't hide something like that. Was beautiful. You shouldn't hide something like that." Clara smiled shyly, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's been years. I used to play a lot. Before things changed." Mrs. Doyle nodded knowingly. "Sometimes life makes us pause the music, but it never really leaves us. Clara didn't know what to say. She just looked back at the piano, her heart heavy but hopeful. Maybe Mrs. Doyle was right. Maybe the music hadn't left her after all. Maybe it had just been waiting. As she walked home that night, the city lights reflected on the wet streets, and she hummed the same tune she had played. For the first time in a long while, she felt a small spark of happiness. A part of her she thought was lost was still there. Quiet but alive. She didn't know it yet, but that small moment in the empty hall would soon change everything. The music inside her was about to find its way back into the world, louder and brighter than ever before. The next evening, Grandwood Hall was alive again, brighter, louder, and busier than ever. The chandeliers glimmered like falling stars, and the smell of fine food floated through the air. Tonight's event was even more special, a private dinner for donors and business leaders. Everyone looked perfect, every detail flawless. Clara moved through the crowd with her usual quiet grace, balancing trays of sparkling glasses. She smiled politely at guests, though inside she still felt the echo of the piano keys from the night before. That small secret moment had stayed with her all day, the feeling of the music flowing through her again. She had almost convinced herself it had just been a dream. Near the stage, the grand piano stood polished and ready. The regular pianist, Mr. Henley, was supposed to perform after dinner. He was well known among the guests, confident, charming, and skilled. The organizers trusted him completely. Clara had seen him play many times before. His fingers always moved perfectly, but his music never seemed to feel alive. As the evening went on, waiters served the main course and guests laughed softly at each other's jokes. Everything seemed smooth until a quiet whisper spread among the staff. Clara noticed two managers talking urgently near the stage. One of them kept glancing toward the empty piano seat. A few minutes later, the head waiter came rushing past her looking worried. "Has anyone seen Mr. Henley?" he asked aloud. No one had. The pianist hadn't arrived. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Soon the whispers turned into tension. The event organizer, a tall woman in a silver dress, spoke in a low but sharp voice. "He called just now, food poisoning. He's not coming." The crowd was starting to notice. A few guests looked toward the piano, expecting music to begin. But there was only silence. The mood in the room began to shift. People were losing interest. Some checked their phones, others sighed. Clara stood near the back, holding a tray of desserts she had forgotten to serve. Her heart was pounding. Every instinct told her to stay quiet. This wasn't her problem. But something stronger inside her whispered, "You can fix this." She hesitated for a long moment. Then she took a slow breath, put the tray down, and stepped toward the organizer. "Ma'am," she said softly. The woman turned, distracted. "Yes, what is it?" Clara's voice trembled slightly. "If you want, I could play." For a second, the organizer just blinked at her, not understanding. "Play? What do you mean?" "The piano," Clara said, her cheeks flushing. "I can play. I used to. Before." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unsure. "You?" she said with mild disbelief. "You're part of the staff." Clara nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. But I know the instrument. I can play something gentle, just so the room doesn't fall silent." The woman looked at her as if deciding whether this was madness or bravery. She turned and glanced around the room. The guests were starting to look impatient. A few had already begun leaving their seats. Something had to be done, and fast. After a long pause, the organizer sighed. "All right," she said finally. "If you think you can handle it, then go ahead. But please don't make a scene." Clara's heart jumped. "Thank you," she whispered. As she walked toward the piano, her hands trembled. Every step felt heavy, like walking into a dream she wasn't supposed to enter. Conversations around her quieted a little, as people noticed the waitress approaching the piano. Some looked amused. Others frowned in confusion. "What's she doing?" One man whispered. "Is that part of the performance?" Another chuckled. Clara sat down carefully, adjusting the bench. Her palms were sweating. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her. For a moment, she thought of getting up and walking away, but then she remembered the feeling from the night before and the peace, the beauty, the connection. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and placed her fingers on the keys. The first note rang out softly, a gentle, trembling sound that floated through the air like a feather. People turned their heads. Another note followed, then another. The melody began to grow, delicate and graceful like sunlight breaking through clouds. Within seconds, the laughter and chatter faded. The hall fell completely silent. The guests who had been half listening now leaned forward, caught off guard by the tenderness in her playing. Clara forgot about everything else. The crowd, the fear, the uniform she was wearing. Her fingers moved faster, surer, telling a story without words. The music was filled with memories. Her childhood lessons, her father's tired smile, the nights she played alone in her small apartment. Every note carried a piece of her life. From the corner, one of the waiters stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. The organizer, who had doubted her, now watched in quiet disbelief. Even the guests, people used to luxury and perfection, seemed humbled. Something raw and real filled the hall, something money couldn't buy. When Clara finally reached the end of the song, she let the last note linger. It hung in the air, soft and pure, before slowly fading away. The silence that followed was heavy, almost holy. Then someone began to clap. One person, then another, until the sound grew into a wave of applause. People stood up cheering, their faces glowing with surprise and admiration. Clara looked around, stunned. Her hands shook slightly, her eyes wide. She stood, gave a small nod, and stepped back from the piano. She wanted to smile, but she could barely breathe. At that moment, she wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a musician again. The applause still echoed in Clara's ears long after she stepped away from the piano. She could hardly believe what had just happened. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood near the side of the stage watching the crowd. People were smiling, clapping, even standing up from their seats. For a moment, she felt like she was floating, like she was dreaming with her eyes open. But as the noise faded, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She was a waitress. She had just stepped out of her role, in front of rich, powerful people, without permission, without training, without warning. What if they thought she was foolish? What if the manager fired her for breaking the rules? Clara's heart started to pound again, not from excitement this time, but fear. She took a few steps back toward the service area, her face flushed. The other waiters stared at her with wide eyes. Some whispered quietly, some smiled, but none of them spoke loud enough for her to hear. She could only guess what they were thinking. The event organizer, the same woman who had allowed her to play, approached her with quick, elegant steps. Her silver dress shimmered under the lights. Clara straightened nervously, ready for a scolding. But the woman stopped in front of her and said softly, You were wonderful." Clara blinked in surprise. Thank you, ma'am. I didn't mean to. I just thought." The woman raised a hand gently. "Relax, you saved the evening." Her tone softened. The guests were beginning to lose interest, and then you turned the whole room around. That was beautiful. Clara smiled shyly, relief flooding her chest. I'm glad it helped. Still, even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the tiny voice of doubt inside her. What if it was just luck? What if they only clapped because they were surprised? When the dinner ended and guests began to leave, several stopped by the piano, asking the staff who the young pianist was. That girl, the one in uniform, they said. She played like a professional. One of the guests, a tall man with silver hair, even tried to tip her directly, pressing a folded note into her hand. For your performance, he said with a wink. Clara quickly shook her head and stepped back. Oh no, sir, I can't accept. I'm just staff. He smiled kindly. Then consider it appreciation, not payment. You've got something special. She didn't know what to say. She thanked him softly and tucked the note away, too stunned to look at it. Later, in the quiet of the staff room, the other waiters finally surrounded her. Clara, that was amazing, one of them said. Where did you learn to play like that? Clara blushed. Just at home. I used to play when I was younger. Another laughed softly. You could quit this job and become famous if you wanted. Clara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It's not that easy, she said quietly. Music doesn't pay the bills right away. After everyone left, she sat alone for a while, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She looked the same uniform, same tired eyes, but something felt different. It was like she'd opened a door inside herself that she had kept locked for years. She thought about herself that she had kept locked for years. She thought about, if doubt lingered, could she really make something of this? Was she brave enough to try? That night, as she walked home, the city lights glimmered on the wet pavement. She clutched her coat tighter and whispered to herself, maybe, just maybe, it's not too late. but even then she wasn't sure if she believed it. The next evening came quietly, wrapped in soft golden light. Grandwood Hall was preparing for another grand event, a winter gala this time, filled with familiar faces and expensive smiles. Everything sparkled, the chandeliers, the silverware, even the laughter that drifted through the air. The piano, as always, stood near the stage, black, shining, untouched. Clara moved through the hall like a shadow, calm but thoughtful. Ever since that unexpected performance, something inside her had changed. She was still wearing her waitress uniform, still carrying trays, still doing her job, but her heart was somewhere else. It was still sitting at that piano. Every time she passed it, she felt a pull, gentle but strong. Her fingers would twitch as if remembering the music by themselves. She tried to ignore it, to focus on her duties, but it was impossible. The sound of the notes from that night still echoed in her mind. As the evening grew busier, Clara noticed something unusual. Several of the guests recognized her. A few nodded politely, some smiled warmly. One woman even whispered to her, "You were the one who played last time, weren't you?" "You were marvelous," Clara blushed, barely managing to smile back. "Thank you, ma'am," she said softly before hurrying away. It felt strange. A week ago, no one even noticed her. Now people were watching her differently, not just as a waitress, but as someone who could do something rare. It scared her a little, but it also made her proud. When the main course was served, the same event manager came over to her. "Clara," she said with a gentle smile, "I was hoping you'd play again tonight." "Everyone keeps asking if you will." Clara froze. Her hands went cold. "Playing again?" The manager nodded. "Yes, the pianist we hired this week isn't coming either. He had a flight delay. Seems like fate wants you back at that piano." For a moment, Clara didn't answer. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. She wanted to say yes, her soul was begging her to say yes, but fear whispered louder. What if this time she wasn't good enough? What if she made a mistake in front of all these people? I don't know, she stammered. Maybe someone else. The manager placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You'll be fine. You've already done it once. Trust yourself." And just like that, Clara found herself standing before the piano again. The crowd noticed her immediately. Some guests smiled in recognition. Others whispered to each other, "It's her again, the waitress pianist." The murmur spread through the room like a gentle wave. Clara adjusted the bench, trying to keep her breathing steady. The lights seemed brighter tonight. The air felt heavier. She looked down at the keys, the same keys that had once given her comfort. Now they looked like a test. For a few seconds, she closed her eyes. She could hear the faint hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the sound of her own nervous breath. Then she remembered her father's words from years ago. "When you play, don't think about people. Think about the music." She let out a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The first note came like a whisper. Soft, hesitant, then another followed and another. Slowly, the melody began to take shape. The crowd quieted instantly. The room seemed to shrink. The lights dimmed in her mind. And all that existed was the piano and her heart. The song she played was one she had written long ago, unfinished, hidden in a notebook somewhere in her apartment. It was a song about hope and fear, about holding on when life pushes you down. Each note carried emotion. The music began softly, like a secret being shared. Then it grew stronger, fuller, braver. Her hands moved with grace and certainty, her body swaying slightly as she played. The guests were spellbound. The laughter, the chatter, grown. Even the staff stood still at the edges of the hall, afraid to move. Some people closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. As the piece reached its middle, the melody rose higher, more passionate. Clara's fingers danced across the keys faster and faster, yet every note was clear. The sound filled the entire hall, bouncing off the tall ceilings and echoing like a voice calling from the past. Tears filled Clara's eyes, but she didn't stop. She wasn't just playing for them, she was playing for herself. For the little girl who once dreamed of performing on a big stage, for the woman who thought her dream had died. And then, just as gently as it began, the song started to fade. The last few notes were quiet, tender like a goodbye. She held the final note for a long, trembling second, then lifted her hands. Silence, not the awkward kind, but the kind that feels sacred. The kind that says something real just happened here. Then came the applause. At first soft, then louder, until it filled every corner of the room. Some people stood, some whistled, some even shouted her name. Cameras flashed. The moment was breathtaking. Clara stood slowly, her heart full and her eyes wet. She smiled shyly and bowed her head. It didn't feel like pride, and it felt like peace. Like something inside her had finally found its way home. As she turned to walk away, she caught sight of one small detail. A young girl near the front staring at her with wide eyes full of wonder. The girl smiled and whispered to her mother, "I want to play piano like her." Clara's chest tightened with emotion. She realized then that her music wasn't just for her anymore. It had touched someone else. When she went backstage, the manager met her with a proud grin. "You did it again," she said. "You made them believe in something." Clara smiled through tears. "I think I made myself believe again too." And in that quiet moment, surrounded by applause and soft light, Clara knew this was just the beginning. For a few moments after Clara left the piano, the sound of applause still filled the air. But even when it slowly faded, something strange remained. A silence deep and thoughtful. The crowd seemed different now. Their smiles weren't just polite. They were real, warm, almost touched by something they didn't expect to feel that night. It was as if the whole hall had changed shape. The chandeliers still shone, the wine still sparkled, but the atmosphere wasn't about wealth anymore. It was about wonder, the kind of wonder people forget they can feel. Guests who had come expecting a fancy dinner found themselves speaking in hushed voices, almost afraid to disturb the softness the music had left behind. One woman wiped her eyes secretly with a napkin. A man who had been talking loudly all evening now sat quietly, staring at the piano, lost in thought. In the back of the hall, a young waiter whispered to another, "Did you see her hands?" It was like she wasn't even trying. The piano just listened to her. The other nodded slowly. It didn't sound like notes. It sounded like feelings. The event manager watched from a distance, smiling to herself. She had worked at dozens of high society dinners, all beautiful but empty. But this night felt alive. It wasn't the decorations or the food that made it special. It was that one ordinary girl who reminded everyone what it meant to feel something real. When Clara returned to her spot behind the curtain, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. Her heart was still racing. The sound of applause echoed in her chest like thunder. For the first time, she wasn't scared anymore. She felt light, almost floating. Mrs. Doyle, the cleaner, appeared beside her, eyes shining. "My girl," she said softly, "you made the whole room stop breathing for a minute." Clara smiled shyly. "Did I really?" "Oh yes," Mrs. Doyle said. "I've seen men who never cried in their lives wiping their eyes out there. You reminded them they've still got hearts." Clara laughed quietly, wiping a tear of her own. "I just played what I felt," Mrs. Doyle nodded. "That's what makes it magic." Meanwhile, out in the hall, the guests couldn't stop talking about her. The pianist waitress had become the highlight of the night. People who didn't usually talk to the staff now asked questions, curious about who she was. "Does she play professionally?" one man asked the organizer. "No," she replied with pride. "She works here, just part of the service team." The man looked surprised. "Impossible. She plays like someone trained at a conservatory." Soon, guests began searching for her to say thank you. Some wanted to take pictures. Others simply wanted to shake her hand. When Clara finally stepped back into the main hall, they turned and clapped again, this time just for her. She froze, completely overwhelmed. Her cheeks turned pink and she gave a small, awkward bow. Laughter filled the room, not mocking but kind. A woman in a blue gown stepped forward and said softly, "That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. You made me remember why I used to love music." Clara didn't know what to say. "Thank you, ma'am," she whispered, her voice shaking. Another guest, the same silver-haired man from the last event, smiled warmly. "You've got something money can't buy," he said. "Heart, don't lose it." The applause started again, softer this time, but even more sincere. Clara smiled through tears, realizing that this moment wasn't just about playing a piano. It was about touching people's lives, even if only for a few minutes. Lives, even if only for a few minutes. As the evening went on, the energy in the hall changed completely. Guests who had been strangers started talking to each other about music, about dreams, about the things they'd forgotten they loved. The mood was lighter, happier, more human. The grand dinner had turned into something far more meaningful, a shared experience that no one could have planned. Later, when most of the guests had left, a few stayed behind to speak to Clara privately. One was a music professor who handed her his card. "If you ever decide to study again," he said gently, "call me. I'd be honored to help." Another was a journalist from a local arts magazine. "I'd love to write about you," she said. "People should know your story." Clara didn't know how to react. She thanked them politely but didn't make promises. It was too much to take in at once. She wasn't used to attention. For so long she had been invisible, and now suddenly everyone could see her. When she finally stepped outside into the cool night, the sky above was clear and full of stars. The sound of the piano still echoed in her mind, but now it mixed with the distant hum of the city. She pulled her coat tighter and smiled to herself. For the first time in years, she felt proud, not because people clapped, but because she had found the courage to be herself again. She thought about her father, about how he used to sit by the window and listen when she practiced. She wished he could have been there tonight. Maybe he would have said what he always used to say after she finished a song, "That's my girl." The next morning, videos of her performance began to appear online. Guests had recorded her secretly, and the clips were spreading fast. One caption read, "The waitress who silenced a room full of millionaires." Thousands of people watched it. Comments poured in. Strangers amazed by her story, inspired by her music. But Clara didn't know any of this yet. That morning, she was back at work, tying her apron, ready to serve again, humble, quiet, and grateful. Inside her, though, something had changed forever. She had rediscovered her voice, and she knew now, deep down, that this was only the beginning of her journey, one that no longer belonged to fear but to music, courage, and the beauty of being seen. The night was quiet again inside Grandwood Hall. The guests had all gone home. The candles were melting down to their last inch, and the staff were cleaning up the last few glasses. The piano still stood under the golden lights, its surface shining like it had secrets of its own. Clara walked slowly toward it, her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. She placed her hand gently on the edge of the piano, her reflection shimmering faintly on the black surface. It felt strange. This instrument that had once been a dream now felt like part of her story again. She could still feel the warmth of the crowd's applause in her heart. It wasn't just noise. It was acceptance, understanding, love. As she stood there, her thoughts drifted to everything that had led to this moment. The long days of work, the exhaustion, the doubt. All of it had brought her here, to this one point where the world had finally heard her voice. She realized then that the piano had always been waiting for her to come back. "Clara?" She turned to see Mrs. Doyle approaching, holding her coat. "You'll catch a cold, love," the older woman said kindly. "It's freezing outside." Clara smiled faintly. "I just needed to say goodbye to it," Mrs. Doyle chuckled. "Goodbye?" "Oh no, dear. Not goodbye. I think this is only the beginning." Clara looked back at the piano and whispered, "Maybe you're right." The next few days were a blur. The video of her performance had spread across the internet. Messages poured in, invitations, interviews, offers. Newspapers called her the waitress pianist who stunned the city. Strangers left comments saying her music made them cry, that it gave them hope. At first, Clara didn't know how to react. She wasn't used to attention. She still took the bus to work, still tied her hair the same way, still wiped tables. But everywhere she went, someone seemed to recognize her. One morning, her manager approached her gently. "Clara," she said, "I think it's time you followed this. We'll miss you here, but you have something special. Don't waste it." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. She had always dreamed of hearing those words. Permission to dream again. That evening, she went home and sat at her old, dusty piano, the same one her father had bought when she was 10. She ran her fingers along the keys and smiled softly. It wasn't perfect anymore. Some keys stuck and the wood had faded. But when she began to play, it still sang beautifully. Her father, sitting nearby in his armchair, smiled proudly. "You never stopped being my little musician," he said in his weak but warm voice. She laughed softly. "I guess I just needed a little reminder." Days later, Grandwood Hall invited her back, not as a waitress this time, but as a performer. The same stage, the same piano, but everything was different now. This time her name was printed on the invitation. When she walked in, wearing a simple white dress instead of her uniform, the staff greeted her with smiles and applause. Mrs. Doyle was there too, her eyes shining with pride. As Clara sat down at the piano again, she took a deep breath and let her fingers rest on the keys. The hall was filled with guests, but this time the fear was gone. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply sharing her heart. The lights dimmed. The audience quieted and she began to play. The melody started softly, like a whisper, then grew into something powerful and free. It wasn't the same song as before. It was new, written from everything she had felt since that night. Joy, fear, gratitude, courage, all woven into sound. People listened without moving. Some smiled, some closed their eyes, some wiped away tears. The music didn't belong to Clara anymore. It belonged to everyone in that room. As she reached the final part, the notes slowed down, tender and peaceful. The last chord came like a sigh. Long, beautiful, final. She held it for as long as she could, her fingers trembling slightly, then let it fade into silence. For a moment, no one spoke. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, like a wave breaking, applause erupted again, louder, fuller, more emotional than ever before. Clara stood up slowly, tears in her eyes. She bowed once, then twice, and looked out at the crowd. The same people who had once looked through her now looked up to her. Among them she saw the young girl from before, clapping with wide, bright eyes. Their gazes met for a brief second and Clara smiled, a knowing, gentle smile that said, "Follow your dream too." When the applause finally quieted, Clara sat again for one last moment. She ran her hand over the piano lid and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." As she stood to leave, the lights glowed warmly behind her, framing her silhouette. The hall that had once been her workplace had now become her stage. Outside, the night air was cool and fresh. She lifted her face toward the sky, breathing in deeply. The city lights twinkled like tiny stars, and she felt lighter than ever before. The world had heard her music, but more importantly, she had heard herself. That was the final chord, not just of the song, but of the life she once lived in silence. A new melody was beginning. The night was quiet again inside Grandwood Hall. The guests had all gone home. The candles were melting down to their last inch, and the staff were cleaning up the last few glasses. The piano still stood under the golden lights, its surface shining like it had secrets of its own. Clara walked slowly toward it, her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. She placed her hand gently on the edge of the piano, her reflection shimmering faintly on the black surface. It felt strange. This instrument that had once been a dream now felt like part of her story again. She could still feel the warmth of the crowd's applause in her heart. It wasn't just noise. It was acceptance, understanding, love. As she stood there, her thoughts drifted to everything that had led to this moment. The long days of work, the exhaustion, the doubt. All of it had brought her here, to this one point where the world had finally heard her voice. She realized then that the piano had always been waiting for her to come back. "Clara," she turned to see Mrs. Doyle approaching, holding her coat. "You'll catch a cold, love," the older woman said kindly. "It's freezing outside." Clara smiled faintly. "I just needed to say goodbye to it," Mrs. Doyle chuckled. "Goodbye?" "Oh no, dear. Not goodbye. I think this is only the beginning." Clara looked back at the piano and whispered, "Maybe you're right." The next few days were a blur. The video of her performance had spread across the internet. Messages poured in, invitations, interviews, offers. Newspapers called her the waitress pianist who stunned the city. Strangers left comments saying her music made them cry, that it gave them hope. At first, Clara didn't know how to react. She wasn't used to attention. She still took the bus to work, still tied her hair the same way, still wiped tables. But everywhere she went, someone seemed to recognize her. One morning, her manager approached her gently. "Clara," she said, "I think it's time you followed this. We'll miss you here, but you have something special. Don't waste it." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. She had always dreamed of hearing those words. Permission to dream again. That evening, she went home and sat at her old dusty piano, the same one her father had bought when she was 10. She ran her fingers along the keys and smiled softly. It wasn't perfect anymore. Some keys stuck and the wood had faded. But when she began to play, it still sang beautifully. But when she began to play, it still sang beautifully. Her father, sitting nearby in his armchair, smiled proudly. "You never stopped being my little musician," he said in his weak but warm voice. She laughed softly. "I guess I just needed a little reminder." Days later, Grandwood Hall invited her back, not as a waitress this time, but as a performer. The same stage, the same piano, but everything was different now. This time her name was printed on the invitation. When she walked in, wearing a simple white dress instead of her uniform, the staff greeted her with smiles and applause. Mrs. Doyle was there too, her eyes shining with pride. As Clara sat down at the piano again, she took a deep breath and let her fingers rest on the keys. The hall was filled with guests, but this time the fear was gone. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply sharing her heart. The lights dimmed. The audience quieted and she began to play. The melody started softly, like a whisper, then grew into something powerful and free. It wasn't the same song as before. It was new, written from everything she had felt since that night. Joy, fear, gratitude, courage, all woven into sound. People listened without moving. Some smiled, some closed their eyes, some wiped away tears. The music didn't belong to Clara anymore. It belonged to everyone in that room. As she reached the final part, the notes slowed down, tender and peaceful. The last chord came like a sigh, long, beautiful, final. She held it for as long as she could, her fingers trembling slightly, then let it fade into silence. For a moment, no one spoke. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, like a wave breaking, applause erupted again, louder, fuller, more emotional than ever before. Clara stood up slowly, tears in her eyes. She bowed once, then twice, and looked out at the crowd. The same people who had once looked through her now looked up to her. Among them, she saw the young girl from before, clapping with wide, bright eyes. Their gazes met for a brief second, and Clara smiled, a knowing, gentle smile that said, "Follow your dream, too." When the applause finally quieted, Clara sat again for one last moment. She ran her hand over the piano lid and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." As she stood to leave, the lights glowed warmly behind her, framing her silhouette. The hall that had once been her workplace had now become her stage. Outside, the night air was cool and fresh. She lifted her face toward the sky, breathing in deeply. The city lights twinkled like tiny stars, and she felt lighter than ever before. The world had heard her music. But more importantly, she had heard herself. That was the final chord, not just of the song, but of the life she once lived in silence. A new melody was beginning. The sun rose slowly over the city, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and gold. Inside her small apartment, Clara sat by the window with a cup of tea in her hands. The newspaper lay open on the table beside her. On the front page was a picture of her at the piano, her face glowing under the stage lights, fingers frozen mid-note. The headline read, "Waitress to Virtuoso, the night Grandwood Hall fell silent." She smiled gently. It still didn't feel real. She could remember every detail of that night. The weight of the piano keys, the warmth of the lights, the sound of the audience standing. But now that it was over, it didn't feel like fame. It felt like peace. Her father sat nearby, reading the same article with his glasses slightly crooked. "I always told you," he said softly. "One day the world would listen." Clara laughed. "You also told me to keep my day job," he chuckled. "Well, even old men can be wrong sometimes." The phone on the table buzzed again. It hadn't stopped all morning. She had messages from reporters, music schools, and even a famous pianist who wanted to meet her. But the one that made her heart skip was from the event manager at Grandwood Hall. "Everyone's still talking about you. If you're free next weekend, we'd like you to play again. This time as our guest artist." Clara smiled at the message, then put the phone down. She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. She knew she would say yes. Outside, the world went on. Cars passing, people rushing, life moving as always. But for Clara, everything looked new, brighter somehow. She wasn't the same person who once served drinks quietly, hoping no one would notice her. She had become something more, someone who had dared to step out of her shadow. Still, she didn't let the attention change her. She continued to help her father, cook dinner, take walks in the park. She visited the same small cafe every morning, where the owner now played recordings of her piano piece on the speakers. Sometimes she would sit quietly in the corner, listening as strangers whispered, "That's her, the waitress pianist." But her favorite moments were the quiet ones, when she sat alone at her piano at home, the old one with a missing key. She played softly in the evenings, not for a crowd, not for cameras, but for herself, for the girl who had once been afraid to dream again. One afternoon there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, a young girl stood there, the same one who had watched her play at the hall. She was holding a small notebook of music sheets. "Miss Clara," the girl said shyly, "my mom found your video online. I started learning piano because of you." Clara's heart melted. "That's wonderful," she said, kneeling down to the girl's height. "Do you like it so far?" The girl nodded eagerly. "I love it, but sometimes it's hard. My fingers don't listen to me yet." Clara smiled softly. "They will. Just be patient. The music always finds its way through, even if it takes time." The girl grinned and handed her a small drawing. It was a picture of Clara sitting at the piano, surrounded by glowing lights. At the top, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "The lady who made the world listen." Clara blinked back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." When the girl left, Clara placed the drawing above her piano. She looked at it for a long time before sitting down to play again. The melody that flowed from her fingers this time was lighter, happier, full of gratitude. As the months passed, Clara's story spread far beyond her city. She played in concerts, on radio shows, even for charity events that raised money for children who wanted to learn music. Each time she sat at a piano, she remembered the night it all began. The moment she took a chance, even when no one believed she should. But through it all, she stayed the same Clara, humble, kind, grounded. She never let fame turn her into someone else. Sometimes after her performances, she would walk back onto the empty stage when everyone had left. She'd place her hand on the piano and whisper, "Thank you." Because she knew that without that moment of courage, the night she dared to play when the pianist didn't show up, none of this would have happened. One evening, long after another beautiful performance, Clara sat at the piano in Grandwood Hall again. The lights were dim, the crowd gone. She pressed a single note, clear, gentle, echoing through the empty space. She smiled. The hall didn't feel grand or intimidating anymore. It felt like home. The same hall that had once seen her as a waitress now saw her as an artist. The same piano that had waited in silence now sang because of her. Clara closed her eyes, whispering softly, "This isn't the end. Just another beginning." And as her fingers glided across the keys one last time, the music rose softly. A final, peaceful melody that drifted into the quiet night beyond the golden walls. The city lights outside shimmered, and for a moment it felt as if the whole world was listening again. Because once upon a time, a simple waitress had dared to take a seat at the piano. And in doing so, she reminded everyone everywhere that dreams never really die, they just wait for the right moment to be played.